when the Brits left them, these countries were like separate in the past, but they were merged in the future. The reason this is so problematic is because this is what caused significant conflict in the future, something that has caused a significant degree of monopolies currently within those states, something that has caused their like dignity to be stripped of and their like access to resources to be stripped of as a result of the UK itself. I'm going to prove two things in my speech. Firstly, why this uniquely is going to be the tipping point, which is going to make sure that either the Nigerian government would have backed down, reached compromise, or not have attacked in the first place. The second thing I'm going to show to you then is moral responsibility in regards to two categories. First is in regards to the past, and second in regards to the present, and how like the UK not contributing to Nigeria and like so heavily has resulted in like long-lasting effects, which have which have caused a significant degree of which have caused massive threat to Biafra and stripping away of the resources to the point to which the basic citizens can access the resources in the first place. The first then, in terms of the tipping point, I'll take the POI before going on.
Yeah, so how do you think the UK entering a proxy conflict with the Soviet Union in Biafra would have resulted in a long-term or short-term end to the conflict?
Great, thank you for giving me your argument. My partner can respond to that better. The first thing then, in terms of the tipping point itself, note that the first thing is when the UK left them, that literally ensured that they were in a weaker position because these are multiple nations which are in conflict with each other historically and are literally at each other's throat, that they put together intentionally. The reason this caused the reason this caused significant damages is because first, the Nigerian states then consolidated power, i.e. the states which were much stronger consolidated a significantly greater degree of power. This looked like them consolidating all of the resources there, like oil, like water, etc., which ensured their monopoly. This means that it deliberately removed like Biafra's dignity. The reason this, note that this means that the people on the ground did not get to access resources like oil and water, etc. This also means they did not get to access economic support, because this is exactly what a country depends on in the first place, right? This is incredibly important because this then means in the future, as a result of the lack of economic support or as a result of the political weakness, they did not get enough support from like their bloc as a whole and were left isolated as well, right? Which is to say, this ensured that Biafra was significantly weaker, and this is like a country that they colonized in the first place. The second thing is that note that the Nigerian group that they were put in with did not like Igbo in the first place, which means that when you put these two groups together, which are now geographically proximate to each other and don't have a lot of political or economic protection, that's exactly when it weakens Igbo a lot more, isolates them, but also puts them under a significantly greater threat of literally erasure in the first place. The reason this is important is because first, they literally had no option then but to move out, i.e. they were literally gentrified from that state in the first place, or they were literally erased from that nation in the first place and had to move elsewhere. This means that not the important historical context of important historical context of the conflict necessarily means that the UK was aware of this and still put them through all of this, and as a result caused all of the mass bloodshed that resulted from these two groups being at such a massive conflict against each other, right? As a result, all of this means that the military protection was necessary as a tipping point, because all of the conflicts that were going on were needed military protection necessarily, right?
On that,
yeah.
Why is it that if other countries like France and South Africa were supporting this secessionist state, the UK in specific is a tipping point?
Because the UK was the one that colonized them. Which is to say, if they had the power to colonize all of these nations in the globe, it is very intuitive to say they were the ones who had the greatest degree of power, because number one, they had consolidated power throughout the entire globe. Literally, if you think of France, UK also has consolidated power within France, or other nations which have given aid to Nigeria in the first place. Which is to say, UK is the one that has the greatest degree of power in the status quo. But the second thing I'm going to do is how UK uniquely has a moral obligation to provide to this, which is unique from UK's uniqueness in terms of the power to begin with. But secondly then, why is UK uniquely capable of this? This answers Ashish's POI. The first thing is the deterrence effect, right? Note that the UK is literally perceived as the strongest nation back then. This is exactly why the support meant so much. It's exactly why the CA set this motion in the first place. Which is to say that note, UK had literally colonized a huge population of the entire globe and caused a significant degree history of cultural erasure as a result of the colonization to begin with. That's exactly why they were hegemonizing the globe in the first place. Exactly why they wanted to take over Nigeria, wanted to take over Africa in order to consolidate all of the power that they already had even more. This is important, right? Because note that this sets a major signaling effect, which is that the Nigerian government would have probably taken a step back. This is extremely crucial because note, Ashish's POI is one that's retrospective in nature. Given that they didn't back down in the first place, means that all of the aid that these countries gave them was not enough to begin with, and as a result, this is a new additional point which would be the tipping point now, right? But secondly then, note that this means that the Nigerian military would probably be a lot more intimidated and would not want to go into war any further because they don't want to lose the military or their own manpower any further, or literally be eviscerated by the fucking UK. Which is to say, they would have either backed down or reached compromise or not have attacked at all. Why is this so crucial, right? Because look at the impacts here, right? The first thing is that the tensions that are existing today, which have caused mass bloodshed and have caused significant political turmoil and political vacuums being created, would not have happened or would have been less amplified in the past. Secondly, note that it's also very intuitive to agree that they wouldn't have any other reason to go into war insofar as they don't think they can access success within that war, or they can access a good meaningful output in that war, when literally UK is the one that they're opposing now, and alongside all of those other countries which haven't been enough retrospectively in the past. The third thing is then, the Biafra leaders right now have been arrested simply because of the threat that they might get freedom at present, and because other countries can perceive that the Biafra is weaker than them and therefore they can go and attack Biafra over and over again. This is one thing that would have stopped. As a result, Biafra would not have nearly as weak as it is now. Now, look, here's why there's a moral responsibility. Because the one thing that I told you at the top of my speech, which is that when the UK invaded them, they were aware of the fact that there's significant turmoil and significant degree of conflict within all of the nations that literally merging together. As a result, it's caused a significantly greater degree of bloodshed. Secondly is that putting together was a way for them to continue the colonization and continue to extract resources. This looks like the fact that shell companies even now extract resources and create monopolization in those areas simply because of the fact that they're weaker political and economic regions, and as a result, we can continue stealing from them in the first place. All of this means that given the past and the present, UK has a significant moral responsibility, despite whatever I told you at the top of my speech, to ensure that they continue giving aid. Proud to propose.
Okay, we thank you for the speech. I'm happy to welcome the leader of the opposition. Here.
If you are a minority group in a newly independent, weak state trying to gain more autonomy, there are two really awful things which could happen to you. And this proposition has the unique distinction of doing both of them at the same time. The first is to explicitly ally this minority movement with the oppressor, to say that any rights we grant the Igbo are an extension of British hegemony, of British cultural destruction, of British colonialism. The second thing you can do to this minority group is to explicitly commit them to a policy which will plunge them into decades of catastrophic war, which they will not win. So if this proposition believes that 3 years of the blockade on Biafra was disastrous, I have news for that team. 3 points in this speech. Firstly, on the principal point about dignity and reparative justice. Secondly, will we actually get a state on meaningful autonomy? And thirdly, even if we got a state, what would this state look like? There'll be some comparative to why we think the present is actually going to be better. Firstly, therefore, on the principle, the claim is basically the UK placed these three groups, the Igbo, the Hausa Fulani, and the Yoruba, into a state arbitrarily. So to undo that, we need to allow them to separate. Several issues with this. First, note that this principle is premised on the outcome being that these groups, the Igbo in particular, actually get more autonomy and actual control. So this is an entirely hung principle. The second thing we'd say is that in the present, I'm going to talk to you more about this in my third point, there is an incentive in Nigerian politics for us to give the Igbo more autonomy because of the very small electoral margins with which all of the major political candidates in Nigeria are currently winning elections. This is exactly the kind of context within which a minority can become a major tipping point factor in whether or not your coalition succeeds, whether you have a stable government, whether you have a majority which can pass budget and spending bills. So having noted that this principle is actually rather free-floating, let's look at the second point. What is actually going to happen in practice? The claim is that the UK, it's going to be the tipping point, right? So here are several reasons why this is not going to be the case. First, Even if I acknowledge that right now, the UK provides huge amounts of military support to Biafra, the obvious response is that for the Soviet Union, the fastest industrializing country in the world at this time, to commensurately increase its support for the Nigerian state as well. That only means that you go from having a short 3-year blockade before the actual concession happens to having a decades-long civil war of the sort which devastates lives en masse. Secondly, they do not understand the context of the UK in this debate. It's true that the UK was the largest empire until quite recently in 1967/70. But at this point, the UK was a country in retreat. Right? So they can fear that the UK gives significant military support now. They cannot fear out all of political reality for all of time. The UK had basically come to see most of its colonial possessions as a waste of time, as drains on resources. 1967 is just after the UK gave up all of its Southeast Asian holdings and gave up India, right, its single largest colony. The UK public had no interest in engaging in a prolonged war because they were also asked the question, well, if we're supporting this secessionist group, are we also going to have support every other secessionist group trying to dissolve the state we refuse to colonize? Are we going to have to support Pakistan? Are we going to support every outer island in Indonesia seeking independence? So even if the support is intense now, there will come a point where the British public turns against it, and that catastrophic collapse in military support means that not only have you angered the relevant country, you now no longer have the resources to actually defend yourself. Third, what I said in my opening, the fact is you have now explicitly allied the Igbo with the single most unpopular and hated political force, not just in Nigeria, but in the whole of West Africa. What does this mean? It means that we go from having a blockade, which while bad for the Igbo, did not actually mean death squads going into this region, did not mean mass military, uncontrolled massacring of civilians, did not mean, God forbid, genocidal actions. When you ally the Igbo to these sorts of colonial narratives, incredibly powerful narratives, you paint a giant reticle on the heads of the community leaders, on their resources, on their roads, on their schools and hospitals. This is a devastating indictment you will subject them to. Fourth, think about the precedent which this sets in the region. Nigeria is not the only, West or Westish African state to have secessionist movements which it wants to get rid of, right? So even if you manage to fund this group of individuals, they're going to have significant resistance from lots of surrounding countries. Because countries know that if, I'll take you in a moment, that if the Igbo do indeed get their country, then our own territorial integrity is going to be compromised.
Olusegun, who won the last Nigerian election pretty handily, what interest does he have in giving handouts to an unliked minority group?
No, it wasn't a handy win. It was actually a 3-way election where his margin actually was incredibly small, all the way from the 6 months before the election all the way to the month before the election. So factually, I think you're lying. But since we want you to give structural reasons, let me just put it this way. Politics in Nigeria is extremely personality-based and extremely arbitrary. There are no large political blocs like left or right-wing parties who cater for people's interests. In a context where politics is very fluid and personality-based, having more support from a minority, but a significant minority like the Igbo gives you a huge electoral advantage. So that's the structural reason, which people tell me debating is all about these days. It feels good to talk about them, actually. So, so there's lots of reasons why we don't think they will actually become successful. So, but let's assume they become successful, right? They get some form of a state. What are the issues which the state now faces? Number one, the most obvious one, the only region in Nigeria with no oil, right? You have now said that, you are now basically going up against the most oil-rich country in the whole of Africa when your resources are very, very commensurately small. What does that mean? It means that continual disturbances across your borders, attempts to undermine your ability to form diplomatic relations with other countries, is going to be rampant. Yes, go for it.
Literally the opposite of this is true.
Yeah.
Biafra is in the 19th.
Okay, good. So here's a structural reason in opposite direction. So they're not going to give you up because they're taking away all of Nigeria's oil. Okay, come on, this is debating. It's a game. You can give me one fact and I'll give you a response. So, okay, cool. So you are now telling Nigeria to give out. Oh, so now the narrative is worse. The narrative is the UK wants to strip us of our oil. They didn't just strip us of our autonomy. They want to take all the oil-rich lands for us. So that justifies even more war. Okay, so the second problem is that states in order to function need to have some kind of recognition and support from surrounding regions and from the rest of the world, right? Given that many other countries have an interest in maintaining territorial integrity and don't want to be caught up into unending post-colonial wars, it's unlikely the states even gets recognition in the General Assembly, for instance. It then gets consigned to the no-man's land of areas like Somaliland, which even if nominally self-governing, have significant problems of self-governance and autonomy. Look at the comparative, and we're not going to say it's great. We're going to say a couple of things, though. Number one, close personality-based elections means actually they do have significant electoral clout. the fact that Nigeria wants to position itself as a preeminent West African power through things like behaving well, contributing a lot to ECOWAS, means that it also has a strong incentive to put in place policies which at least empower them to some extent, which is why they're discussing things like affirmative action for Igbo in some regions at the present, right? So we're not saying it's great. We're just saying decades of vicious internecine conflict is much worse. For all these reasons, track the votes.
We thank the speaker for the speech, and I'm now happy to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister, Sir Dear.
Well, you could tell by that speech that she's really enjoying retirement. I want to start with this, that there is a specific context under which this is happening. The British, as they were leaving those colonial countries, were negotiating with them as to the best position to put them in. So for example, in Ghana, the Western Togoland was given an opportunity to engage in a referendum as to whether they wanted to be fully a part of Ghana or not. And this happened across those regions, except for one small state called Biafra. These guys were not given the opportunity to determine for themselves whether they wanted to be a part of a state that was going to continuously marginalize them, given the historical context that it in itself was happening. I think this clarification kills a lot of things around whether the British will continue to fund this or whether they will continue to have support, because recognize that at that moment there was a lot of support for what means do we have to be able to resolve this and leave them in a peaceful situation, or leave those countries in a peaceful situation. The process of decolonization is never complete if it is replete with actions which continually undermine the statehood of these individuals, and I think that's the cautionary tale we need to necessarily take from this. This means that they will still have the access to the resources, given that they were resolved to put a solution to this to the end, and they were not likely going to be left behind. But secondly, it gave the British legitimacy to do this in a way beyond all of the actors which they were talking about, and that in itself proves the tipping point which we analyzed to you within the first speech. There are a couple of things I want to talk about. I want to first of all deal with the comparative which they bring, because this is poorly analyzed. They say, well, you have the numbers to be able to determine swing votes, not clear how this necessarily happens. But the last election tells you a story. Peter Obi, who was the Igbo candidate, was necessarily undermined severally. Currently, his case is in the Supreme Court, where these justices were voted by the majority in power. Tinubu is a 96-year-old war criminal and like a drug lord who still managed to win these elections. And why is this so? Because the system is broken in a couple of ways. First of all, the federal system ensures that the northern tribes necessarily have a major advantage by owning more states than the Igbos. Two, they have way bigger populations than the Igbo people, who are the tiniest among the three major tribes within Nigeria. Two, there's internal witch hunting and marginalization of the people, which means there's demonization. So when Peter Obi took up his candidacy, they said, yes, when the Igbo come in, they will pay us back for all of these wars. It is Biafra coming in, and therefore do not vote for them. Two, also means systematically undermining them by giving them less education and by violence against these people within different regions, which means that they are continually scattered within the nation, and they develop political apathy and want to leave and no longer want to engage within the political system. This kills OO for a couple of reasons. One, the internal mechanization of ensuring that this self-determination happens is removed. But secondly, the only way by which they even continue to protect themselves within that state is removed to a massive degree, and we think that in itself is very problematic. Their comparative, or they say our comparative of giving them a state is worse. I've never heard of this before. Lesotho, Namibia, etc., and those countries within the southern regions are able to live independently, even though they broke away from the larger section. Even if this war happens, I think that especially at that moment of decolonization, there is far more impetus to have a resolution which would ensure that all these countries necessarily come to being. secure.
Do you think Igbo today in Nigeria would be treated better or worse if they were viewed as a historical lackeys of the British?
No, I don't think they will continually be there. I don't think they would still be there, like within Nigeria, to still be treated that way. But then I think the comparative is even better on our side of the house. We think a state for the Igbo people works well for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it gives them the grandstanding to be able to argue for themselves, which no one has been able to do for a very long period of time. Which means that most often than not, they would have their own resources. They also have the ability to develop their own weapons, which would ensure that they are not continually being attacked by these very people. I think the level of agitation which is happening within Nigeria is even worse than what would have happened, given that they know that there are no repercussions when they treat the people of Biafra this way. And that's why their leader has been imprisoned, and there's no international concern. When they are a state, there's far more international concern and repercussions, and therefore there's less likely going to be the kind of conflict which you talk about. Like, you don't just say this state to be created and they will always be at war. I think the ways in which these things develop would mean that this in itself is not so. So I don't think that the states feel threatened in that instance. But let me analyze the tipping point and also answer why these states do not feel threatened in the way in which Ashish talks about. Because first of all, you need to understand that at that point where the demarcation necessarily happens, these individuals would be good. Their expectation for them was that they will be left the way they were brought about. So they are not going to feel greedy about someone else's oil and say that, well, we need to attack them. The expectation is that you came to meet us as a northern tribe, and therefore if you leave us as a northern tribe, most often than not, they will still be satisfied. I think the point at which you put them together and they say they want to leave, that was the precursor to creating those internal friction. No, I'm not taking more POS. Internal friction, which you yourself do talk about. I'll take one from CEO that I think we're supposed to take two. Which created the internal friction. Therefore, it is less likely going to feel that these states feel threatened, and therefore they were going to go. Against them. CEO.
I think there are dozens of ethnic groups within this region advocating for independence at the same time in highly similar ways. Would you provide extensive military support to all of them, and if not, what differentiates?
No, that's ridiculous. I already explained that the process of decolonization ensured that there was discussions between these groups as to what they necessarily wanted to do. Some groups opted to align themselves with other countries and whatnot. Those who were not given the opportunity, and that's the starting point, right? You need to necessarily open up these discussions. And because they were not open, it created that situation, and therefore the British needed to intervene in order to correct this. I think this has a couple of implications. First of all, the moral responsibility on them to ensure that the way this decolonization is done is in a way that is proportional and it's a way that brings satisfaction to those people was very, very important in helping them to achieve that. But secondly, self-defense. And I think this is very crucial for those very people, because by removing support for them, you actually empowered the Nigerian state to continue to clamp down on these people, give them the incentive to do so. And because that incentive continues to exist, and because those reasons continue to exist, these people are continuously marginalized, and that marginalization is not going to go away today, not tomorrow, because these people are stuck. We think that if you give them their own resources, they have better capacity to be able to protect themselves, better capacity to be able to respond to these threats in a way in which you do not get in status quo. Panel, we think that this needed to be done. Britain fucked up, and we should have corrected it. Thank you.
Okay, we thank you for the speech, and I'm happy to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
I'll first discuss the process of conflict and why you likely will not get an independent Biafran state. Then I'll explain long-term instability and why even if you get such a state, it won't be functioning, and in the more likely case where you don't, it will be substantially hurt. Beginning with the process of conflict, I want to observe that their claim on the right to self-determination is contingent on actually getting the self-determination. So Britain can support the state all they want, but if you don't get self-determination, you're not accessing that right. What you are accessing instead is a sustained period of substantially more repression of the Igbo people. Their claim is the Nigerian government would have backed down. The first observation Ashish made is they didn't back down with French support, and it's unclear why the UK would be much of an addition in this regard. What are the arguments we hear for why the UK is unique? First, we hear that the UK engaged in colonization, consolidated the region, and therefore was seen as powerful, forgetting the existence of French West Africa, like Niger, which shares the largest border with Nigeria. I don't understand this argument. Their better claim is the UK requires legitimacy for decolonization, which requires success. The UK, for example, enabled referenda in a range of other states to give them self-determination. This creates an incentive on part of the UK to give them substantially more support. There are a number of reasons this is an insufficient mechanism to guarantee self-determination. First, in response to UK military support, the Soviets would likely substantially scale up arms sales and military support for the Nigerian state in its attempt to repress the Biafran region. Remember the Soviet justification for intervention here. The Soviet Union wanted to position themselves as an anti-colonial power. They wanted to gain support abroad by positioning themselves as bastions who pressured the West into decolonization amid the Cold War. Additionally, they wanted to reduce the scope of US influence in a lot of these states, which often took the form of diplomatic relations with the UK. So the entry of the colonizer into this conflict helps the Soviet Union strengthen this internal narrative in an attempt to gain soft power legitimacy in West Africa. This means, in addition to the fact that you want to win as the Soviet Union, this creates a massive marginal incentive for the massive economy of the Soviet Union, larger than the recently decolonized Britain, to send weapons and arms sales to the region. That means even if Britain has a good incentive, it's unclear why this incentive translates to the capacity to actually fix this problem. No, thank you. But second, the UK's capacity to access capital was reasonably scarce during this period. So there's still a couple of decades after World War II, after the Marshall Plan, the UK faced a reduction in resources. The amount of money the UK could extract from other colonies in order to engage in reallocation of resources was fairly limited. As a consequence, it's not clear you would have the ability to send tons of arms to these regions. If you did have the ability, it would come at a grave opportunity cost. Because remember, Nigeria's blockade of the region constituted probably a genocide, and we acknowledge this happened on our side. Millions of people dying of starvation. But one of the few ways to get through this genocide was British humanitarian aid. Where do you think this money comes from? If the UK has limited resources and needs to send military aid to the region, that probably means substantial gutting in humanitarian aid. But third, all the incentives they name for decolonization looking good on the UK's part also applied to France, who was seen as a colonial power in the region. So French support had these incentives. It didn't work. It's unclear why UK's support having these incentives would provide a substantial margin for working. What changes on our side, however, is a substantial change in morale, because they're perceiving the Nigerian state as a rational actor that responds to incentives of deterrence. But strategic decisions of newly post-colonial states were not rational in quite the same way. Rather, viewing the colonizer as coming to the support of an independent region is likely a substantial political motivation to try to win the conflict more, to engage in more repression, to view the ethnic group of the Igbo people as collaborators with a colonial regime that causes substantially more repression. As a consequence, it is unlikely that you even get a state, especially since BP Shell don't really want Biafra to function as an independent state, so they are unlikely to use their capital to extract Biafran oil either. So you don't get a state. What you get is a much more brutal conflict. We acknowledge there was a blockade, but the blockade is likely compounded by substantial support to see the Igbo people, thank you, as the villain, as the enemy, and engage in direct genocide. Yeah.
The UK was arming the Nigerian government. So insofar as you characterize this blockade as genocidal, when does a country have an obligation to participate?
We are happy to advocate the UK not arming the Nigerian government. This House believes that next year or whatever. Second, let's talk about the long-term stability of the Nigerian state. First, I just want to talk about the mischaracterization of the Nigerian election. Firstly, Peter Obi was not seen as the Igbo Biafran candidate. He was a two-term governor of Anambra State. I don't know what they're talking about. I also don't know what they're talking about when they say the Nigerian election was an overwhelming win for Bola Tinubu, who won 35% of the vote as part of the All Progressives Congress. Like, this was one of the most contested Nigerian elections recently. The People's Democratic Party, the main opposition under Atiku Abubakar, won a bunch of votes. Peter Obi's Labour Party actually won the vote in Lagos, which is the largest city in Nigeria. So I have no idea what they're talking about when they say the election was an overwhelming clear result. They say Obi is stuck up in the court process because he challenged the results of the election. Yeah, that is probably true. But the key point is, the way you compete in elections is unlikely to be scaring people that the Biafran candidate will claim all the money. No, thank you, because then they'll get all the votes. And in close elections, you cannot possibly afford that. But I also want to point out, there's an additional incentive to resolve the situation of Igbo separatism in a relatively peaceful way. What is that incentive? There is a massive opportunity cost where the Nigerian military is spread too thin, with jihadists in the northeast, heavily armed criminal gangs in the northwest engaging in substantial kidnapping, clashes between Fulani herders, sedentary farmers across much of the country means the Nigerian military is spread too thin, and this creates a substantial incentive to find a peaceful resolution for the Biafran state. Compounded by the fact that after the war ended, the Biafran state experienced really rapid reconstruction, where Nigeria pumped its oil money into the Biafran state in order to engage in its reconstruction. This goes away when you either have an independent Biafran state or a Biafran region that is seen as continuing to pose an existential threat to Nigeria.
So you have one example of where an Igbo candidate came so close. Can you name one example of an Igbo president?
No, obviously, the Igbo have faced political exclusion in Nigeria over the past few decades. We are arguing this exclusion would get worse. It would likely be formalized when we view them as representatives of the British. The situation would be significantly worse. At minimum, we're able to get some scope for a peaceful solution for this region. So the Biafran region is going to face a lot more repression. It's going to face institutionalized discrimination and even more political exclusion. But suppose you do get an independent Biafran state. We have no real sense of why the state would be functioning. Yeah, it has oil, but BP Shell probably want to extract oil from a bunch of different places. You're probably more likely to get monopolization that they're scared of in a new state that has no other alternatives to access investment. You're probably going to get the resource curse, because if all you have is the Biafran region is oil and very little scope to diversify, you don't have the support of the massive resources of the Nigerian state that you fall under. More likely you're going to become dependent on oil and not diversify your economy to other things, making it incredibly volatile when oil prices go up and down. But an independent Biafran state is going to struggle to get capital for post-conflict reconstruction. It's going to struggle to get the UK to send it aid for a long period of time, and it's going to struggle in poverty. So what you get is a genocide and long-term instability. Happy to oppose.
Okay, we thank you for the speech, and now I'm happy to welcome Emerald Darwin to open the debate on the bottom half. Here.
She ends his speech by saying we should not plunge Nigeria into decades of internecine conflict. This is an argument you often hear in debates like this, that we must prioritize stability over the right of self-determination, over the capacity of people to shape their own laws or their own destiny, because it is so important that we achieve that. But the question is, has this ever worked? And the answer is no. If you look at all of the other states where people have said we must prioritize stability, that stability never lasts where self-determination is denied. Which is exactly why South Sudan still split away from Sudan in a very brutal civil war. It's exactly why Eritrea split away from Ethiopia in a brutal civil war. Whenever you deny self-determination, it just bottles the conflict, it intensifies it, and things explode down the line far more violently than they would have if you'd resolved it at the first instance. So beyond, I would say, being immoral to deny people that right of self-determination, it is ineffective if your goal is to achieve peace, and is something that you ought not do for that very reason. Just look at the fact that, as Tejas acknowledges, the biggest killer of people in Nigeria, an order of magnitude greater than that of jihadism, is farmer-herder conflicts that primarily occur on the basis of ethnicity because of conflict that has been bottled, that has not been addressed, and that can only be prevented when we achieve self-determination for that people. The Nigerian Delta is not at peace right now, and it has not been at peace since 1967. If the goal of this debate was to achieve peace, that could only occur in the world where the UK supported Biafra, allowed an independent state to exist, and self-determination was achieved. So, the first thing we can do in this speech is just contest the arguments opening opposition makes about the status quo being good, explain why the trajectory is negative, and secondly, explain why an independent Biafra is viable, which addresses opening opposition on their own grounds of victory. Yes, Errol.
Yeah, so the independent states you name, like South Sudan and Eritrea, resulted in protracted conflict between the original state and the independent state. Why is that better stability?
So the argument is that attempting to deny this breakup of those states just results in the conflict occurring down the line. We're not saying that conflict is good. We're saying Nigeria will inevitably have that conflict anyway. As the farmer-herder conflicts indicate, that conflict will occur within the next decade or two regardless, because self-determination has been denied. Firstly, let's deal with the status quo. I think much of this introduction points to why the status quo is bad, is unstable, and is likely to devolve into conflict in the near future. But let's deal with the incentives that opening opposition gives as to why things might get better for the Igbo people. They really provide one main mechanism, which is just to say elections are tight, which is why you need to appeal to minority groups like the Igbo, and therefore they're very likely to be able to benefit. Firstly, we contest whether this is factually true. We point out in a POI that often the APC is able to win quite clearly. Look at the last president, Muhammad Buhari, followed by Bolu Tinubu, all of the same party, all appealing to majorities. And secondly, we point out that people who have been in government for a very long time have a number of other ways in which they can win elections. Things like appealing to incumbency bias, things like being able to give out handouts, engaging in populism, playing up ethnic tensions that benefit the majority, and that their policy of appealing to a disliked minority group is exactly contrary to the interests of someone who plays ethnic politics and wants to play up the fact that they're a member of the majority ethnic group within the country. Appealing to a minority group is very likely to lose you popularity, not gain you popularity, which is why that is unlikely to be a successful strategy. Contrast that now with what you would likely be able to get with an independent Biafra. 4 reasons why this is possible. The first thing we'd note is that the UK was the primary backer of the Nigerian government. They were the primary provider of aid to that country. So flipping that support to the other side of the conflict obviously would have a very substantial difference in changing what would occur. Opening opposition says, well, weren't France and Israel supporting Biafra, so why would the UK be a tipping point? Firstly, the UK is a much more powerful military than either of those countries. Secondly, it was committed much more substantially to the conflict because it was a former colonial power with much closer ties. And thirdly, it had a great capacity to assist because it had military infrastructure in the region because it was a colonial power in that region that had military bases in the region. But secondly, to counter their claim that the Soviet Union is too powerful to resist, we would point out that the US was neutral in the conflict because you had allied powers on both sides of the conflict, but at the point in time where the UK and France are on the same side supporting Biafra, and the Soviet Union is the only country that is supporting the Nigerian government, this creates a very strong incentive for the US government to massively increase aid to Biafra because the policy of containment that is believed in, that the US government believed in, means it must oppose the Soviet Union at every instance where it's possible. And now that Britain isn't on the same side as the Soviet Union, obviously massive amounts of US aid pour in, which is a far larger economy than the Soviet Union, which is a far stronger military power than the Soviet Union, and one that would obviously be able to overwhelm the Soviet Union there. Which also explains why their arguments about longevity do not work here, because the US belief in domino theory and the need to contain communism was so strong that they're willing to commit in the long term the resources needed. But as I'll demonstrate later, probably wouldn't need to commit to a very long war. Thirdly, we just point out that the nature of the conflict that occurs was one that could easily have been altered in its trajectory with even relatively small shifts in military power. That is to say that the strategy of the Nigerian government in winning the Nigerian civil war was to engage in a blockade of Biafra and attempt to starve the population, and over 1 million people died during this blockade. Maintaining that kind of blockade requires vast military superiority over the other party, and that is something that even if you believe Britain isn't the strongest military power, losing at least a very sizable amount of support and shifting to the other side probably means you don't have that level of military superiority over your opposition. You probably can't engage in that level of commission of war crimes. And we note that that in and of itself is a huge win. It means that those things did not occur. It means that fewer people died. But finally, we note that the end goal of this conflict doesn't require us to convince the people in Nigeria that they shouldn't want to maintain Biafra in their own country. Obviously, that's not likely. We just need to convince them that it's likely policing. No, okay.
So in addition to the fact that the US's policy of containment got us bloody proxy conflicts like Vietnam and Korea, the US was caught up in things like the Vietnam War, meaning it wouldn't have the capacity to either.
So was the Soviet Union. They provided substantial support to North Vietnamese. Obviously, these countries have the capacity to fight on multiple fronts. That was largely how the Cold War was conducted. But largely, we point out that you don't need to convince Nigeria that they don't want Biafra. You need to convince them that the cost of retaking Biafra would be far too high, and being able to provide sufficient amount of support to that country means that other desires within the country, like that of economic development, like that of stability, like not wanting to die in a futile war, are likely to take over and likely to create the incentives that allow peace to occur, as it has in a variety of other countries that have split up but then been able to reconcile after the fact, which is why the conflict is likely to end. Why is this the largest benefit in the debate? Firstly, an independent state means less conflict in the long run, because when you're part of the same state, there is a zero-sum conflict of who gets to be in control, which means that you have to have conflict in every instance. But when you run separate states, each ethnic group has capacity to run their own state. There's no need for that form of conflict. Conflict over resources is reduced because you have your own pot of resources to draw from. Secondly, it means that we don't have war crimes, and as Mark points to in a POI, it's a moral obligation not to engage in that. Thirdly, there's a strong message in favor of self-determination that makes it less likely that dictators engage in repression against attempts at self-determination because they believe that there will be a punishment for doing so. All of this is why you ought to support CG.
Okay, we thank you for the speech, and now I'm happy to welcome a member of the opposition. Here, Jeremy.
Good to go. This is great. Okay. Two extensions in this speech. Firstly, why the act of supplying arms is so harmful, and secondly, how this affects other African countries and their territorial integrity. Firstly, on arms. I think the important characterization here is that the military aid that is extensive that is supplied to Biafra is likely to come in the form of arms. Why is that likely to be the case? Firstly, because of the condition of the United Kingdom at this point in time. So the issue is that the United Kingdom is still experiencing intense war exhaustion. This war exhaustion is firstly financial war exhaustion. So at this point, the UK is still deeply in debt to the United States for the support that was given to them during the Second World War. They don't have necessarily money for a new military adventure. But secondly, it's popular demoralization. The British public is tired of war. They're tired of seeing their soldiers die abroad. They don't want to send boots on the ground. So what this support looks like is the UK using its sort of reserve military production left over from the war and sending it to Biafra. Why is that important? Firstly, because of how this is distributed. Because crucially, at the time, particularly among the Igbo, there had been no tradition of state institutions. And while that means that there was resistance on the part of Biafra and a somewhat organized movement in favor of a state, there was no state at the time, which means that resistance to Nigeria was not conducted in the form of a traditional army, as we might think about it in the modern times, but was mostly organized based on localized units like clans. Why is that important? It means that the distribution of arms given by the UK in support of Biafra is not done in a conventional way. It's not done supplying a military to uniformed soldiers who are conducting like pitched battles against the Nigerian oppressor. Rather, it's handed out level by level to local authorities and leaders who distribute it to people who are in many cases very much indistinguishable from civilians to wage sort of localized resistance. What then occurs? I think the first important thing to note occurs is that the Igbo probably still lose this conflict. I think that opening has done an okay job of explaining why this is the case. I'll add some things in response to CG. I think the first thing to note is that at this stage of the Cold War, we're not yet at a place where it's just the United States and the USSR, right? Right after the Second World War, and for like a 20 to even 25-year period after this, the United States is still very, very suspicious of the United Kingdom as a kind of third imperialist way between capitalism and laissez-faire and communism. Why is this the case? Firstly, because the United Kingdom has been a dominant power in global affairs for a very long time. It had one of the largest land areas under its control right up until the decolonial period. But secondly, because even at conferences like Yalta, there were clear distinctions between US interests in like Wilsonian sovereignty and UK's interest in maintaining its colonial possessions. And what this functionally means is it's incorrect for CG to just assume that at this point the policy of the US is a difference between like containment, containing communism, and doing nothing. But I think the US also has an interest in ensuring that UK's influence in its former colonial holdings breaks down so it is the dominant superpower in the Western world. What this means then is that the US is not coming to the aid of Biafra if the UK supports Biafra. And as I've already characterized, the UK is pretty weak at this time. I think opening did a good job there. I think one more important piece of characterization to add here is that the Soviet Union is particularly strong, particularly because it doesn't absorb the same political costs for intervention that Western countries do. Simply because it is an autocracy, and that means that largely whatever Stalin and the higher echelons of the party decide is foreign policy, and the expenditures that they can make in terms of military production are far, far larger than what the US could make. That's why even though the US, towards the end of the Cold War especially, had a far larger economy, they were being matched in military production by the Soviet Union because there were fewer mechanisms for the Soviet public to press for consumer spending. So what is ultimately the harm if nothing changes in terms of the outcome of the war? The harm is in terms of how the end of the war is prosecuted. Because if it is the case that the UK is this large, powerful country with a huge ability to produce arms and distribute them across Biafran civilians, what that does is it creates a heavily armed Igbo population that is much more of a threat for future insurgencies and future rebellions to the government than in the status quo timeline. What that means is when Biafra falls, when the Nigerian government takes the cities in Biafra, they are much more ruthless in terms of how they prosecute the end of the war, and they are much broader in terms of whose homes they search, who they arrest as soldiers, and what sorts of methods of prosecution they enact to ensure that this region of the country is not a threat into the future. What does this do? It scales up the actual deaths in the conflict. It scales up the repressions and the ethnic transfers that are likely to follow as the Nigerian government attempts to seize the region. We think this is a pretty certain impact in the debate insofar as they necessarily have to concede arms. OG literally says that it's like self-defense because you're going to arm these people. And obviously, if there is a much higher military capacity, much more broadly dispersed, that's going to result in a higher preventative action from the Nigerian government. I want to briefly note how this extension engages with the other teams in the round. I think, firstly, all of the analysis we do on why there is not going to be an independent Biafra refutes CG and it refutes OG, because most of their benefits are premised on the idea that you are eventually going to get an independent state. Before I move to a second extension, OG.
All claims of proxy wars have been speculated within this debate. There was less appetite for supporting these things, especially after colonization. Only Britain had the impetus under the guise of being able to fix the mess that they had caused. All of these things are...
Well, this is like just wrong. Like, it is just true that the Soviet Union engaged in a wide variety of proxy wars all across Africa to ensure that these states were communist for ideological reasons, but also to ensure it had allies with a lot of access to raw resources and large populations to support them in the coming struggle with other rivals. I think that, moving secondly, I should take another PR from CG.
Yeah, your mom is like, they would be pretty mean to the Igbo people afterwards. They committed a 3-year blockade where they tried to starve all of those people and then have disenfranchised them to this day. What exactly is the scale of intensity you're talking about here?
The scale is pretty large because if after the blockade all of the people still have really advanced rifles in their homes, you can kill them, you can deport them or move them to other the country, you can break up their political blocks so they can never organize against you again. Like, there are things a whole lot worse than a 3-year starvation campaign, especially in the context of African decolonization. Okay, I'm going to drop the second extension because there's no time and just talk about why this one is round winning. I think firstly, in comparison to closing government, it's already true that it's not the case that you're going to get an independent Biafran state, and so obviously we want to make this conflict as peaceful as possible in terms of it happening. It was bad in the status quo, it will be worse on their side. But secondly, I want to say that the status quo is okay, and I want to extend again over opening opposition their relatively implausible mechanism for why things are fine right now. Because it's true, right? There's no real reason why we should believe the Igbo are important swing voters in literally every Nigerian election. The actual reason that the Igbo are treated okay in modern Nigeria is just cost-minimizing reasons. Firstly, because this is a large group of concentrated people in the south with a particular identity that could cause problems for the government, Nigeria has extended some degree of federalism to this region to prevent future revolts, and we think that federalism has granted them a basic degree of rights and comfort within the Nigerian state. So it's not a dichotomy, right? Don't believe MG when he says, that you can, it's all or nothing, zero-sum control of the state. Obviously, you can devolve powers. But secondly and importantly, the Igbos sit on the Niger Delta. After oil was discovered, obviously their cooperation is enormously important in being able to extract this vital resource. If the Igbo oppose you, you have no ability to impose security over this region. There's intense capacity for sabotage. Nobody wants to invest, etc. And that means that you want to work with them, at least to some extent, and share the revenues. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Okay, we're going to speak for his speech. I'm happy to welcome the government with the close debate on the government side. Cheers.
bench likes to criticize us. They spend very little time defending what they actually stand for. The first thing they have to stand for is a vile conflict that killed over 1 million people. The word blockade sounds kind of peaceful and serene, but what it amounts to is mass starvation, death from lack of medical supplies, where people get sepsis and easily avoidable diseases and die from it. Indiscriminate killing that applies to combatants and non-combatants alike. And also, by their own admitting, this means Britain's complicity in these genocidal activities. They say, well, we don't need to support this, the wording of the motion. Like, no, that's not the rules. I'm afraid you do have to support this, my friend. The second thing they have to support is ongoing strife. The Niger Delta has been a hotspot of violence for decades. And so insofar as they say we'd rather have peace than war, they still have ongoing war on their side. Because when they get, that is the status quo. You get horrible conflicts, and worse, it is even more horrible because this is a region that's controlled by an oppressor who was previously at war with them. And sure, it might be marginally worse because it's like they can be portrayed as being the lackeys of the UK. You can still portray them as being the lackeys of Israel per the info slide, or France, or many other areas, or whatever. And sure, there's a tiny little difference, but usually this is backwards reasoning, where you dislike them and then come up with a reason for it, rather than having a particularly good rhetorical line that then makes everyone really hate them. The other thing they say is that, well, they're treated really well, because you need to appeal to them to win elections. First of all, they're not a swing group, they tend to vote with other Southerners most of the time anyway, and so they just aren't a voting bloc that the Northerners care about. Second of all, they're disenfranchised anyway to a significant degree, that they're just not that many votes. But third of all, and most critically, their support is mutually exclusive with the support of other groups. For instance, if you want to win the votes of racists and minorities, you can't win over the racists and the minorities. If you support the minorities, then the racists are going to be really mad. And so, if you have a large number of people who dislike this particular minority, you can't get that minority's votes, because if you get them, you lose the majority's votes. So actually this makes them politically toxic, and this flips their stuff and shows why they get systematically marginalised in elections. Third of all, per Une's introduction, there is the risk of this exploding because they are maltreated in the status quo. So insofar as they claim to fix violence, at best they merely postpone it. But fourth of all, what this has done is given carte blanche to other countries to brutally marginalise all sorts of independence movements there. Because this says you can do anything to them. You can do everything short of genocide, and we are still going to give you weaponry. And that's why you see, basically free reign happening in Darfur or South Sudan and Eritrea. Opening?
Sorry, your side continues to have a blockade, and it continues to have brutal massacring of the Igbo people.
Yeah.
However, on our side, over the long term, you have an incentive for relative stability, because your resources for the military are spread far too thin.
Okay.
It's true there's a genocide on both sides, it's much worse on yours.
One, when there's fighting, you can expand the military. They can do this through control of oil wells that generate a lot of wealth to expand the military. Two, the incentive doesn't apply to individual political actors, it applies to the country as a whole. Unfortunately, it's the individual political actors that are the ones that are making decisions, not the country as a whole. Third of all, the second half of this speech responds to the stuff about how we have violence on our side, we actually end up fixing the blockade. But I'll start by responding to closing opposition. So they have that one extension, which is about how you get chaos because the Igbo are highly disorganised. First of all, they lasted 3 years. They're probably quite highly organised insofar as they were able to go toe-to-toe with a very large military. Second of all, there would be organisational help from the British, because insofar as the British are providing them with aircraft, you need to provide them with refuelling infrastructure, you need to have some sort of chain of command for intelligence sharing, all sorts of other things. And so, insofar as they are disorganised now, British help would make them far more organised, and so you actually fix the problem. Third of all, there's no difference in severity of harm, because on their, maybe on our side, disorganised rebels have more machine guns than machetes, but insofar as they have machetes, they can still do just as much bad. Look to the Rwandan genocide, and on their side, you can still point to them as being as much of a danger as otherwise, insofar as they have taken up arms against the state before, very marginal. Closing off?
Sure, so I think the problem is that it's not that they're disorganized in the sense that they can't coordinate a campaign, it's that they're disorganized in the sense that the power structures that the British would have to interact with are dispersed. That means you have to arm a dispersed range of people, that there's no central command.
No, well the point is that you would create a central command, because the central command is the one that distributes resources such as fuel, artillery, heavy weaponry, and air support. Finally, how closing government fixes the problem. We are able to fix the conflict in Biafra. We said why the UK is unique. First of all, it is militarily supporting the Nigerian government. And insofar as they are the largest provider of military hardware, if they withdraw the support of replacement parts, it means that they are simply unable to operate as much of their military hardware as otherwise. Second of all, they're the biggest military in the region. They are far better connected. They have networks of bases. They are the closest ally to the USA, and so they're able to bring in American support, or at least the threat of American support. And third of all, they're able to break the blockade because they have far better access to this area. And so what this means is you're able to get international diplomatic support. The Biafrans are able to continue the fight and not be strangled off by a blockade, and the Nigerian military is at risk of having its hardware withdrawn from it. The second thing that opening opposition says is the USSR gets involved. So what? Well, first of all, they probably don't. They don't like escalation at this point in history. Closing opposition is talking about Stalin, who died a decade prior. We're talking about the post-Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia, that didn't want to escalate conflicts and was willing to step back from the brink. Second of all, Soviet support does little good. It's really hard for them to get stuff to that area. It's really far away from the rest of the USSR's field of influence. But also, the USSR support often doesn't mean very much. Like, they gave Libya a bunch of tanks, and they ate shit when they went toe-to-toe with Chad, right? Who was a far less well-equipped military. And so, it doesn't just give you an easy way to win. The USSR, isn't just going to suddenly get instantly involved. They have so many other priorities, and one country in West Africa isn't going to be the one. They didn't believe in domino theory like the USA did. The third thing is they say, well, if there's oil in the area, the Nigerian government won't give up. But our point was that they must give up because they are outgunned, because they are losing too many men, because there are all sorts of political incentives, and if they go on, they will just keep on eating shit and will have to give up. So, the other thing we need to establish now that we have established you actually are able to get an independent Biafra, is that the state is good. They say it's going to be bad in opening opposition because you get a resource curse. But one, often there just isn't one. The UAE seems to be doing pretty fine with its oil wealth. Two, if you have international support, there is a lot of international scrutiny. There's probably a lot of assistance from the West in terms of setting up a stable civil service that can actually manage things, anti-corruption support, etc. But third of all, Nigeria is still oil dependent, and so you have the exact same problem on their side anyway. So on our side, you have close support of the international community. But remember, we didn't need a highly functional state. We just needed to beat the status quo, and we just needed to beat the alternative of mass-scale violence, of unbridled brutality, of mass starvation and death from preventable illness. That's what we did at base, at minimum, and that is easily enough to wipe out the opposition bench. But in addition, we showed how we have the seeds of a productive and peaceful state, and that's why this has to go to closing government.
Okay, we thank you for the speech, and now I'm happy to welcome the opposition leader to close the debate as a whole. Here.
I think it's easy to over-focus in debates like these on grand narratives of violence, of the oppressive Nigerian government imposing blockades and mass violence on the Biafrans. What has been suggested throughout the opposition bench is that to significant degrees this happens on either side. What I think Max uniquely talks to you about is how dangerous and widespread this small-scale chaos happens when you give large amounts of arms into an area that's highly decentralized, highly unstable, and expect them to forge peace out of this process. I want to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, what happens to the Biafran political system over the medium to long term, and why that is highly uncertain in either world. Second of all, bringing back core parts of the extension on decentralized violence and why there are more repression of the Igbo people and weighing us up. And then lastly, some extraneous moral stuff that I have done. Firstly, on what happens to the Biafran political system. So we get kind of two versions of the same claim from the government, right? What OG says is this will enable the Brits to reach, or the Biafrans rather, to reach a compromise with the Nigerian state in a way that's productive. I think the OG version of this case is not particularly compelling, right? There is no coherent response, I think, to the line from OO, which is just they received lots of support from other European states, which seems sufficient. They say things like the UK was the colonizer, therefore they have more power. Obviously, the other states also were colonizers, and to that extent, have arms. And the French military is decent, and then claps into their moral obligations claim, where I think it's been refuted sufficiently at this point in the debate. So I want to point out that, I'll talk about CG in a second, but I think the OG version of this argument does not stand up and does not respond to lots and lots of content from the op bench on why, for instance, into the long term, the British support is likely to collapse, and so that you get a Biafran state that isn't able to be independent over the long term. So you might delay the point at which the Biafrans get crushed, but you don't actually, help them have a long-term, right to self-determination. I'll take a
Yeah. Sorry.
close.
The reason Nigeria relied on a blockade of Biafra is because they lacked the political will to sacrifice thousands of soldiers in a full invasion. Our explanation of why the blockade can't occur without British support explains why the counterfactual is one in which Biafra can succeed as an independent country.
Well, so I think the blockade, you have the same ability to like deprive them of humanitarian resources, right? So I think there's been a significant amount of content on like Soviet influence and why that's significant. And I think it's just like, okay, I guess I can respond to this now, right? The responses are like, Russia is far away. Like that, clearly there are many other places in this region that Russia is involved in. And like it gives you, if you provide extensive military support to a country that you are in an active proxy war, like it just seems obviously reasonable from OO to say that the Soviets are likely to intervene in this region. I don't really think we get a reasonable response to this from CG. So, responding to other CG bits here then, they say the British have a large military, and they just kind of say this, right? Like I think the French military is significant, lots of material on why, from like Max as well, on why the UK is still engaging in post-war reconstruction at this time. They say there's likely to be some long-term investment because of like Cold War politics. We would know that this kind of Cold War politics is a lot stronger in the US at this point in time than the UK, who's facing a lot of domestic economic concerns. So it's not clear to us that this is going to motivate like military support of Biafra into like the medium to long term, decades after, once things have settled down into this, which creates like, which helps all of Max's argumentation in terms of why the Igbo people get oppressed later on when they become, like have a target on their back because of British military support. But also there are just lots and lots of reasons as to why the Nigerian government isn't likely to concede to power in this way. And like the Soviet thing is one thing from OO, right? But there are significant pre-colonial tensions that exist in this region that precede colonialism. There are religious divides based on the fact that Igbo are largely Christian, the House of Fulani are Muslim. There is the democratic system that exists temporarily. It creates an explicit incentive to like find a group and put a target on their back and oppress them in order to gain more votes in a place where like your ability to do actual economic policy is limited. There's an incentive to extract resources from them over time, given this area is extremely oil rich. And these are all reasons as to why you're unlikely to engage in the kind of peaceful compromise that the CG case is dependent on in this debate. Charlton.
So not clear why the narrative that the Igbos were aligning with the oppressor would exist when there was a concession that Britain was helping the states reach self-determination. The non-aligned movement was championed by Pan-African leaders who were willing not to be drawn into these kind of conflicts.
Well, okay, I think it is, I don't know a ton about the Pan-African movement, but I think clearly there was a lot of like anti-colonial resentment in Nigeria and most of this region at the time. It seems generally reasonable to say that like interfering in this way is going to be unpopular. What I want to say, the last thing I want to do here is just explain why the independent state is likely to be bad. And Taylor spends like 20 seconds in this in DLO and talks about the resource curse, which is a fascinating argument to make, given that Ashish originally says that this is a barren wasteland with no resources. But also there are lots and lots of other reasons as to why the independent state will fail, right? Firstly, there are no like institutions that exist in this area. They say the UK is going to set up institutions. Why, right? Like they have proved they will give them arms for some amount of time to fiat that. They can't fiat that you're going to like go in and set up a new settlement and like a functioning government with courts and justice systems and a welfare system in an area that's highly impoverished. So the state will likely fail and not be able to provide basic things economically to people. Which means that even if they can prove that there is some degree of state-sponsored violence, like the number of people who die from things like poverty and starvation is likely to be larger in many cases. Secondly, they're extremely isolated from the rest of the region, right? So your largest border is with Nigeria, who like hates you because you've just engaged in a large war with them. So you're unlikely to be able to trade significantly or export oil, etc. So you don't have an educated elite who can make good technocratic choices. And so the conclusion of all this is that this is likely to be a failed state that is extremely unsuccessful. And so they can't just make like moral arguments about self-determination, because if everyone is dying in this country and is miserable, then probably that isn't very good for them. Notice how high burden this claim is from CG then, in comparison to all of the material that Max gives you in terms of why putting arms into a region that is unstable is broadly bad, right? He tells you two things specifically here. One on how this area is decentralized. They say the British will make it centralized. How will the British make it centralized, right? This is an area with lots and lots of different ethnic groups that doesn't have, no thanks, a centralized military entity and where there are internal disagreements over what the correct course of action ought to be. So it isn't just like a homogenous entity. There are different ethnic groups. So the reason why you get things like the Niger Delta Avengers in the status quo having massive uprisings is because there are different ethnic groups that have different like views on, for instance, the level of foreign interference with oil that should happen. They say some other things. They say the revolution lasted a while, therefore it's probably like organized. I don't think that's a real argument, right? Like there is war in Syria for a long time. That doesn't mean like all of the rebel groups in Syria are organized into one mega faction. It just means that they're like powerful individual groups. And then I think there are like a lot of reasons that Max gives you as to why spreading arms into the region is bad in this way. First of all, the capacity of you to like have more internal conflict between ethnic groups in that region that are diverse, the capacity for having more terrorism in this region and in oil-rich regions where there's already a significant degree of violence. And I want to weigh here that uncertainty it is uncertain from other teams in this debate what is likely to happen with the Nigerian political system. So O seems to think that like Biafra is going to be like Michigan and like a swing district in which they like somehow change elections, right? OG thinks that you get a peaceful negotiation. Like there are maybe logical problems with both. What is probably certain is that putting lots and lots of guns and tanks and bullets into an area where there are lots of pre-existing political tensions is a bad idea and will cause death and starvation, and we should not do it. We're very proud to oppose.